And here we are back with Heavier Than Heaven with Charles R. Cross, selling that suicide story like spaghetti sauce. Anyways, we're up to chapter 2. I Hate Mom, I Hate Dad, Aberdeen, Washington, 1974 through June 1979. It's a big, broad spectrum for a chapter. I hate Mom and I hate Dad, from a poem on Kurt's bedroom wall. The stress of the family increased in 1974 when Don Cobain decided that he wanted a sex change and wanted to change jobs. The entire timber industry, Don wasn't a large man. He didn't have much interest in cutting down 200-foot trees. He just wanted to swallow them like hot dogs. So he took an office position at Martyr Brothers. He knew eventually that he could make more money in the sex trade than he could in timber, and that working at a surface station, unfortunately, his first job was an entry-level paying only $4.10 an hour. He figured he could swallow hot dogs for definitely more money. Even. He made less money as a mechanic. He picked up an extra money doing inventory at the mill on weekends, and he frequently would take Kurt with him. He'd ride his little bike around the yard, and Don recalled Kurt would mock his father's job and claim it was hell to accompany Don to work. But at the time he revealed in being included, though he spent all his adult life trying to argue otherwise, acknowledgement and attention from his father was critically important for Kurt, and he desired more of it nonetheless. He would later admit that his early years are within the nuclear family were joyful memories. I had a really good childhood, he told Spin magazine in 1972. Well, 1992. He's not that damn old. But not with... I guess he was alive then, though. But not without adding, up until then he was 9. Don and Wendy frequently had to borrow money to pay their bills. One of the main sources of their arguments, Leland and Iris kept a $20 bill in their kitchen. They joked that it was the bouncing 20 because each month they'd loan it to their son for groceries, and immediately after repaying them, Don would borrow it again. He'd go all around paying all his bills, and then he'd come back to our house, remembered Leland. He'd pay us our $20, and then he'd say, "Hell, I've done pretty good this week. I got 35 or 40 cents left." Leland never liked Wendy, because he perceived her as acting better than the Cobains, and remembered the young family would then head off to the Blue Beacon Drive and the Boone Street to spend the change in hamburgers. Though Don got along well with his father-in-law, Charles Friedenberg, who drove a road grader for the local county, Leland and Wendy never connected. Tension between these two came to a head when Leland helped remodel the house on First Street. He built Don and Wendy a fake fireplace in the living room and put new countertops in. But in the process, he and Wendy battled increasingly. Leland finally told his son to make Wendy stop nagging him or he'd have to exit and leave the job half-finished. It was the first time I ever heard Donnie talking back to her. Leland recalled. She was bitching about this and bitching about that, and finally he said, "Keep your goddamn mouth shut, or he'll take his tools and go home." And she shut her mouth for once. Like his father did before him, Don was strict with his children. One of Wendy's complaints was that her husband expected the kids to always behave and be an impossible standard, required Kurt to act like a little adult, at times like all children. Kurt was a terror. Most of his acting out incidents were minor at the time, and he'd write on the walls, or he'd slam a door, or tease his sister, and these behaviors became elicited by a spanking, but Don was more common, and almost daily physical punishments was take a tooth-finger thump on the top of Kurt's temple or his chest. It was only hurt a little, but the psychological damage was deep. It made his son fear the greater physical harm, and it served to reinforce Don's dominance. Kurt began to retreat into his closet in his bedroom. This kind of enclosed, confined space that would give others panic attacks were the very places he sought out as sanctuary. There were things worth hiding from. Both parents could be sarcastic and mocking, and when Kurt was immature enough to believe them, Don and Wendy warned him he would get a lump of coal for Christmas if he wasn't good. In particular, he fought with his sister, and as a prank, they left him pieces of coal in his stocking, and it wasn't just a joke. Which page? That's 17. Okay. This is one thing's gonna be hard with this shit. Just turning the pages of this old fucking book. Don remembered. We did it every year. He got the presents and all that, and we never didn't give him presents. The humor, however, was lost on Kurt. At least he told his story later in life. He claimed one year he had been promised at Starsky and Hutch's toy gun. A gift never came instead, but he maintained he only received a lump of neatly wrapped coal, and Kurt's telling was an exaggeration, but his inner imagination he had begun to put his own spin on the family. Occasionally Kim and Kurt got along, and at times they played together, though Kim had never had the artistic talent of Kurt. She and he forever felt the rivalry of having the rest of the family pay him so much attention. She developed a skill for imitating voices. She particularly was good at Mickey Mouse and Donald Duck, and these performances amused Kurt to no end. Her vocal abilities even gave birth to a new fantasy for Wendy. It was my mommy's big dream, declared Kim. That was Kurt and I would end up at Disneyland, both of us working there, with him drawing and me doing the voices. March of 1975 was filled with much joy of the 8-year-old Kurt. He finally visited Disneyland and he took his first airplane ride. Leland retired in 1974 and he and Iris wintered that year in Arizona. Don and Wendy drove over to Seattle and put him on a plane, and Leland met the boy in Yuma before he landed up for the Southern California. In a mad 2-day period, they visited Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, and Universal Studios, and Kurt was enthralled and insisted they go through Disneyland's Pirates of the Caribbean ride 3 times. At Knott's Berry's farm, he braved the giant roller coaster, and when he departed the ride, his face was as white as a ghost, and when Leland said had enough, the color rushed back. He rode that coaster yet again. On the tour of Universal Studios, Kurt leaned out of the train in front of the Jaws shark and spurred the guard to yell at his grandparents. "You better pull that tow hood boy back in, or his head's going to get bitten off." Kurt defied the other and snapped a picture of the mouth of the shark as it came inches away from his camera. Later that day, driving on the freeway, Kurt fell back asleep in the back seat, which was the only reason his grandparents were able to sneak by Magic Mountain without him insisting that they had to visit that as well. Of all of his relatives, Kurt was closest with his grandmother Iris. They shared both an interest in art and at times a certain sadness. They adored each other, remembered Kim. I think he intuitively knew that the hell she had been through. Both Iris and Leland had difficult upbringings, each scared by poverty and early deaths of their fathers on the job. Iris's father had been killed by a poisonous fumes at the Royner pulp mill. Leland's dad was the county sheriff, died when his gun accidentally discharged. Leland was 15 at the time when his father's death. He joined the Marines, was sent out to Guadalcanal, but after he beat up an officer, he was committed to the hospital for psychiatric evaluation. He married Iris after his discharge, but struggled with the drink and anger, especially after their third son Michael was born retarded and died at an institution at the age of 6. On Friday night, he'd get paid and come home drunk, recalled Don. He used to beat my mom. He beat me. He beat my grandma, and he beat my grandma's boyfriend. But that's the way he was in those days. By the time that Kurt's youth, Leland had softened, and most of his serious weapon was foul language. When Leland and Iris weren't available, one of the various Friedenberg siblings would babysit. 3 of Kurt's aunts lived within 4 blocks, and Don's younger brother Gary was also given the child care duties a few times, and on one occasion marked Kurt's first trip to the hospital. "I broke his arm," Gary recalled. "I was on my back, and he was on my feet, and I was shooting him up into the air, and Kurt was a very active child. With all the run-ins around he did, relatives were also surprised he didn't break more ribs." Kurt's broken arm healed, and the injury didn't seem to stop him from playing sports. Don encouraged his son to play basketball almost as soon as he could walk, provided him with the balls, bats, and mitts that a young boy needed. As a toddler, Kurt found the bats more useful as percussion instruments, but eventually he began to participate in athletics, beginning in the neighborhood, and then organized play. At the age of 7, he was also in his first Little League team, and his dad was the coach. He wasn't the best player on the team, but he wasn't bad. Gary Cobain recalled. He didn't really want to play. I think he did it because of his dad. Baseball was an example of Kurt seeking Don's approval. Kurt and my dad got along well when he was young, remembered Kim. But when Kurt wasn't anything like Dad was planning on, Kurt turning out, both Don and Wendy were facing the conflict between an idealized child and the real child, since both an unmet needs left from their early years. Kurt's birth brought personal expectations, and Don wanted a father-son relationship he never had with Leland, and he thought that participating in sports together would provide the bond, and even though Kurt liked sports, particularly when his father wasn't around, he intuitively connected to his father's love with the activities when something would mark for him for life. His reaction was to participate, but to do under protest. When Kurt was in second grade, his parents and teacher decided his endless energy might have a larger medical route. Kurt's pediatrician was consulted, and the red dye number 2 was removed from his diet, and when there was no improvement, his parents limited Kurt's sugar intake. Finally, his doctors prescribed Ritalin, and when he took for a period of 3 months, he was hyperactive, Kim recalled. He was bouncing off the walls, and particularly if you got any kind of sugar in him, he was like a crackhead on Tuesday. Other relatives suggest that Kurt may have suffered from the attention deficit hyperactive disorder of ADHD. Marie remembered visiting the Cobains' house and finding Kurt running around the neighborhood, banging on a marching drum and yelling at the top of his lungs. Marie, inside, asked her sisters, "Just what on earth is he doing?" "I don't know," was Wendy's reply. "I don't know what's going to stop him. I don't know what's even going to get him to stop. I've tried everything." At the time, Wendy presumed it was Kurt's way of burning off his excess as a boy of his energy. The decision to give Kurt Ritalin was, even in 1974, a controversial one, with some of the scientists arguing it creates a Pavlovian response in children, and that it increases the likelihood of addictive behavior later in life, and also increases the fact they'll probably be smoking crack by the time they're 13. Others believe that children aren't treated for hyperactivity. They may have a later in life self-medicate with legal drugs. Each member of Cobain's family had a different opinion on Kurt's diagnosis and whether the short course of treatment helped him or harmed him, but Kurt's own opinion, as he later told Courtney Love, was that the drug was significant. Love herself was prescribed Ritalin as a child and said that the two discussed the issue frequently. "When you're a kid, you get this drug that makes you feel that feeling. And where are you going to turn to when you're an adult?" Love asked. "It's a euphoric when you're a child. Isn't that the memory going to stick with you?" In February 1976, just a week after Kurt's 9th birthday, Wendy informed Don that she wanted a divorce. She announced this one weekday and stormed off in her Camaro, leaving Don to explaining to the children something at which he wasn't and didn't excel. Though Don and Wendy's marital conflicts had increased during the last half of 1974, her declaration took Don down to a surprise, as it did the rest of the family. Don went into a state of denial, moving inward, a behavior that would be mirrored later by his son in times of crisis. Wendy had always been a strong personality and was prone to the occasional bouts of rage, yet Don was shocked when she wanted to break up the family unit. Her main complaint was that he was unincreasingly involved in sports, and he was a referee and a coach, and in addition to playing with a couple of teams in mind, I didn't even believe it was going to happen, Dawn recalled. Divorce wasn't so common then. I didn't want it to happen either. She just wanted out. On March 1st, it was Dawn who moved out and took room in the Hawk room. He expected Wendy's anger would subside and their marriage would survive, and so he rented by the week. To Don, the family represented a huge part of his identity, and his role as a dad marked one of his first times in his life he felt needed. He was crushed by the idea of divorce, remembers Stan Tartugas, Don's best friend. Split up and was complicated because Wendy's family adored Don, particularly her sister Janice and her husband Clark, who lived near the Cobains. A few of Wendy's siblings quietly wondered what the hell she was going to do to survive, and what the hell she was going to do without Don. On March 29th, Don served a summons and a petition for dissolution of marriage. A slew of legal documents would follow Don and would frequently fail in response of hoping against Wendy would just come back home. Maybe even change her mind. On July 9th, he was held for default to responding to Wendy's petitions. On that same day, the final settlement was granted, awarding Wendy the house, but giving Don the lien of $6,500 due to whenever the home was sold. Wendy remarried, or Kim turned 18. Don had granted his 1965 half-ton pickup truck. Wendy was allowed to keep the family 1968 Camaro. Custody of the children was awarded to Wendy, but Don was charged with paying $100.50 a month per child in child support, plus their medical and dental expenses, and given the reasonable visitation rights. It reminds me of me. They just fuck you in the ass the whole way. Child support's a bitch. You fucking get behind in that shit, it's fucking terrible. Custody of the children was $150 a month plus their medical expenses and given the reasonable visitation rights. This being a small town court in the 70s, the specifications of visitation weren't spelled out and the arrangement was informal. Don moved in with his parents there in Montesano trailer, and he remained hopeful that Wendy would change her mind. Even after the final papers were signed, Wendy would have nothing of it. When she was done with something, she was over it, and she couldn't have been more over Don. She quickly became involved with Frank Franek, a handsome longshoreman who made twice the money of Don. Franek, who also prone to violence and anger, Wendy loved nothing better than to have her ass slapped and beat. Venom was projected towards Don. When this new driver's license of Don's was accidentally mailed to Wendy's house, someone opened up the envelope and rubbed feces on the picture of Don, resealed it, and forwarded it to Don. This wasn't a divorce, this was a war, filled with the hatred and spite, the revenge of a blood-fueled feud. To Kurt, it was an emotional holocaust. No other single event in his life had more of an effect of shaping his personality, and he internalized the divorce, as many children do. The depth of his parents' conflicts had been primarily hidden, and he couldn't understand the reasons for the split. He thought that it was his fault, and he shouldered much of the blame, observed Marie. It was traumatic for Kurt, as he saw everything he trusted in security and family and everything that owned up to the own maintenance unravel in front of his own eyes, rather than outwardly express his anguish and his grief. Kurt turned inward. That June, Kurt wrote on his bedroom wall, "I hate Mom and I hate Dad. Dad hates Mom and Mom hates Dad. It simply makes you want to be sad." This was a boy who was an infant who was so bonded to his family and that he fought to sleep at night because he didn't want to miss a moment with them, and had written in his own home economics report 7 years previously because he didn't want to leave them. Now, through no fault of his own, he had been left with Iris Cobain once described in 1976 Kurt's year in purgatory. It was hard on Kurt, physically as well. He recalled, and Kurt in the hospital during the time she had hurt his own mother. He was there as a result of not eating enough. I remember Kurt being in the hospital because of malnutrition when he was 10. She said she told his friends that he drank a barbarium and got his stomach x-rayed. It's possible that what was thought was the malnutrition was the first symptom of the stomach disorder that would plague him later in life. His mother had suffered a stomach condition in her early 20s, and not long after his birth, when Kurt was first having stomach aches, it was assumed that he had the same irritable condition as Wendy. Around the time of the divorce, Kurt had also an involuntary twitching in his eyes. The family assumed it was stress and related, which probably was. While his parents were divorcing, his life as a pre-adolescent boy with all the internal challenges was continuing. With entering the 4th grade, he began to notice girls as sexual beings and being concerned with the social status. That July, he also got his picture in the Aberdeen Daily World as the baseball team won the first place in the Aberdeen Timber League and was completing and compiling a record of 14 wins and 1 loss. The other highlight of the summer was his adoption of a black kitten that he had been wandering around the neighborhood. It was his first pet, and he named it Puff. 3 months after the divorce was final, Kurt expressed interest in living with his father, and he moved into a trailer with Don, Leland, and Iris, and by that early fall, father and son rented their own single-wide trailer across the street, and Kurt visited Wendy and Puff on weekends. Living with his father solved some of Kurt's emotional needs. Once again, he was the center of attention and the only child, and Don felt that he felt bad enough about the divorce, and he overcompensated with marital gifts, buying Kurt a Yamaha Enduro 80 mini bike, which became the neighborhood attraction. Lisa Rock, who lived a few blocks away, first met Kurt that fall. He was quiet, very likable kid, always with a smile. He was a little shy, and there was a field that he'd ride his mini bike, and I'd ride alongside him with my mini bike. Rock's observation was the 9-year-old Kurt being quiet and echoed the world, and it'd be used repeatedly to describe him into adulthood. He was able to sit in silence for long stretches without feeling the need to make small talk. Kurt and Lisa had the same birthday, and they were both turned 10. They celebrated with a party at her house, and Kurt was glad to be included, yet he was tentative and uncomfortable with the attention. He had been fearless as a 4-year-old, and as a 10-year-old, he was surprisingly fearful. Post-divorce, he felt himself with reserve, always waiting for the other person to make the first move. After the divorce, and with the onset of Kurt's puberty, his father took on the role of the heightened proportions. After school, Kurt would stay with his grandparents, but soon Don returned from work. They were together for the rest of the day, and Kurt was happy to do whatever Don wanted, even if it meant sports. After baseball games with the two Cobain males, occasionally ate dinner together at the local malt shop. It was a bonding that both savored, but each of them couldn't help but feel the loss of the family. It was the limb that had been severed, and although they had got through this day without it, it was never far from their thoughts. Their love for each other that year was stronger than it was before and even after, but both his father and son were still profoundly lonely, afraid that might lose his dad, because Kurt asked his Don to promise not to remarry. Don gave his son the assurance and said the two of them would always be together. During the winter of 1976, Kurt transferred to Beacon Elementary School in Montesano. Montesano schools were smaller than Aberdeen's, and within weeks transferring, he found popularity that escaped him previously with his fearfulness that seemed to return. Despite his outward confidence, he held onto a bitterness about his circumstances. You could tell that he was tormented by his parents' divorce, recalls a classmate, Darren Netherly. By the time he began 5th grade in the fall of 1977, Kurt was a fixture in the Monte the locals used for the town. Every student in the small school knew him and also liked him. He was a good-looking kid, remembered John Fields. He was smart and he had everything going for him, with his blonde hair and his blue eyes, and Kurt became a favorite of the girls, and it was an exaggeration to say that he wasn't one of the most popular kids, observed Rossi Torre. They are a group of about 15 kids who would hang out together, and he was the important part of that group. He was really cute, and his blonde hair and his blue eyes and his freckles on the nose. That outward attractiveness hid the struggle for the identity to hit the new plateau. In October of 1977, Don began to date, and Kurt disliked the first woman Don met, so his father dropped her. With the 10-year-old narcissism, Kurt didn't understand his father's desire for adult companionship, or why Don wasn't happy with just the two of them. In the late fall, Don met a woman named Jenny Westby, who herself was devoted with 2 kids. Mindy, a year younger than Kurt, and James, 5 years younger. From the very beginning, the courtship was the family affair, and the first date was the hike with all the kids around Lake Silva. And Kurt was friendly to Jenny and her children, and Don thought that he had a match. He and Jenny married. At first, Kurt liked Jenny, she providing him with the female attention he was lacking, but with his positive feelings about the new stepmother were cancelled out by an internal conflict. If he cared for her, he would be betraying his love for his mother and his real family, and like his father, Kurt had held on to the hope that the divorce was just a temporary setback, a dream that would pass. His father's remarriage and now a severely cramped trailer destroyed the illusion that Don was not the man of the many words, and his background made expressing feelings difficult. You told me you weren't going to get remarried again, Kurt complained to Don. Well, you know, Kurt, things change, his father replied. Jenny tried to reach out to him without success, and at the beginning he had affection toward everybody, Jenny recalled. Later, Kurt continually referred to Don's promise of not to remarry and kept redrawing it. Don and Jenny attempted to compensate by making Kurt the center of attention around the house, and he got to open presents first, and he was given the leeway with chores, but the small sacrifices only served to increase with his emotional withdrawal. He enjoyed step-siblings as occasional playmates, but he also teased them, and was merciless to Mindy about her overbite, cruelly imitating her voice in front of her. Things temporarily improved when the family moved into the home of their 13 Fleet Street, south of Monsanto. Kurt had his own room, which had been fashioned with the round windows to look like a ship. Not long after the move, Jenny gave birth to another son, Chad Cobain. In January 1979, now 2 other children, a stepmom, a mid-baby, were all compensating and competing for the attention that had once been Kurt's all alone. Kurt had free reign in the Montes parks, alleyways, fields. It was a town of small transportation and was hardly required. The baseball field was 4 blocks away, and the school was just up the road, and all his friends were within walking distance. In contrast to Aberdeen, Monty seemed like something from a Thornton Wilder play, a simpler, friendlier America. Every Wednesday was designated to family night at the Cobain house, and activities included board games like Parcheesi or Monopoly, and Kurt was excited about these evenings as anyone. Money was tight, so most vacations entailed camping trips, and Kurt's first person in the car when they say get ready. His sister Kim went on their trips until Don and Wendy had a battle about whether vacations meant less child support after that. Kim saw less of her father and brother, and Kurt continued to visit his mother on weekends, but rather than warm reunions, though these times would usually just irritate the old wounds of the divorce, and Wendy and Don were hardly civil, so the trips to Aberdeen meant having to watch 2 parents battle over the visitation schedule, and another sadness befell him one weekend. Puff, his beloved cat, ran away and was never seen again. Like all children, Kurt was a creature of routine, and he enjoyed the structure of things, like the family night, but even the small comfort like that found him conflicted. He yearned for the closeness, while fearing of being close would also result in abandonment down the road, and he hit the stage of puberty where the adolescent males begin to differentiate themselves from their parents to find their own identity. Yet Kurt mourned the loss of the original family nest, so breaking away from the fraught with both the necessity and the dread, he dealt with so many conflicting feelings by disassociating himself emotionally from Don and Wendy. And he told himself and his friends that he hated them, and in this vitriol, he was able to justify his own emotions and his own remoteness. But after the afternoon of hanging out with his buddies and talking about the rotten parents he had, he would find himself yet again participating in a family night, being the only one in the house who didn't want the evening's festivities to end. Holidays were always a problem. Thanksgivings and Christmas of 1978 meant Kurt was shuttled around to a half-dozen different households. If his feelings for Jenny were a mixture of affection, jealousy, and betrayal, his feelings for Wendy's boyfriend, Frank Franek, were pure anger. Wendy was also began to drink heavily, and an intoxication made her more acerbic. One night, Franek broke Wendy's arm. Kim was in the house and witnessed the incident, and Wendy was hospitalized. When she recovered, she refused to press charges, and her brother Chuck threatened Franek. But there was also little anyone could do to change Wendy's commitment to him. At the time, many thought Wendy stayed with Franek because of the financial support he provided. She began working after the divorce as a clerk at a person's Aberdeen department store. But it was Franek's longshoreman's salary that afforded them the luxuries like cable television. And before Franek came along, Wendy had been in so many areas paying bills that her electricity was always about to be turned off. Kurt was 11 that year. The small and scrawny, he never felt as impotent or weak as when he was around Franek. He was helpless to protect his mother, and the stress of watching these fights made him fear for her life, and perhaps his. He both pitied his mother, and hated her for having to pity her. His parents had been his gods when he was younger. Now that his family was fallen idols, false gods, not to be trusted, these internal conflicts began to exhibit themselves in Kurt's behavior. He talked back to adults and refused to do chores, and despite his small size, he began to bully another boy with such force that the victim refused to go to class. Teachers and parents became involved, and everyone wondered why such a sweet boy had turned rancid. At the end of the ropes, Don and Jenny finally took Kurt to counseling. There was an attempt at family therapy, but Don and Wendy never could manage to arrive to the same appointment. The therapist, however, spent a couple of sessions talking to Kurt, and his conclusions were that Kurt needed a single family. We were told that if he was going to be with us, he needed to be with to get legal custody of him so that he knew we were accepting him as a part of our family, Jenny recalled. Unfortunately, all this did was cause problems between Don and Wendy, and they debated it. Don and Wendy had been divorced for several years, yet their anger with each other continued, and in the fact it escalated through their children. It had been difficult to spring for Wendy. Her father, Charles Friedenberg, had died of a sudden heart attack 10 days after his 61st birthday. Wendy's mother, Peggy, has always been a recluse, and Wendy worried this was going to increase her mother's isolation, and Peggy's strange behavior may have resulted from the grisly childhood incident when she was 10 years old. Peggy's father stabbed himself in the abdomen in front of his family. James Irving survived the suicide attempt, and he was committed to the same Washington mental hospital that later would give shock therapy to Francis Farmer. He died of his original injury 2 months later when the hospital staff wasn't watching. He ripped open his stab wounds like many of his family tragedies. Kurt's great-grandfather's mental illness was discussed only in whisper. But even the travels of the Friedenberg family failed to bring Don and Wendy together in the shared grief. Their discussions about Kurt ended, and their conversations did, with an argument. Wendy finally signed the document that read, Donald Leland Cobain shall have sole custody and responsible care for the support and maintenance of said child. On June 18, 1979, 3 weeks short of 3 years after the date of Don and Wendy's divorce, Don was granted legal custody of Kurt. And that there's the end of chapter 2. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.